The stuff that I use regularly is a Bible dictionary, a Bible atlas, and then every once in a while the geographic commentaries. Otherwise, I just find rereading to be the thing that does it for me, builds my understanding. And a category that doesn't exist much in confessional Lutheranism, an exception to which is the book The Hardening that we talked about at lunch by Paul Hensel, is biblical theology, where you're just surveying the Bible for a concept or an image or whatever. And I love those because it puts so much together for me. Yeah. But unfortunately in America, largely it's the Reformed that seem to do biblical theology. Yeah. Okay. Let's keep going here in 1 Corinthians 1. Any thoughts on, God did not send me to baptize but to evangelize? God did not send me to baptize but to evangelize.
I did, but Flemmy answered it for me.
Okay. Mr. Fleming, what would you answer?
Baptism is a stationary activity. The people that you baptize, you should probably have some kind of spiritual charge over. St. Paul is sent to preach in multiple places.
Yeah.
So it just makes more sense.
Yeah. So yeah, and that's an interesting way of thinking about it. The work is divided up according to movement and degree of movement. This is a little hard for us to understand because we generally don't think of anyone in the ministry as necessarily moving around, or when we do, it's like unnatural, right? Like we might have a missionary, but he's a missionary until he starts a congregation, and then he stays there, right? We generally don't have I have a guy in the second year class that told me this is what he wants to do. We'll see if that's what actually happens or if the Missouri Synod can figure out how to contain it. But what he wants to do is serially plant churches, right? So he wants to plant a church and then move on and plant another church and move on and plant another church. Problem is we don't have any funding model for that. We do it overseas, I guess, but not.
Like some of our sister churches overseas, they have this category like evangelists where they go and.
Yeah, and we had guys like that in districts, but it's been a long time, and I don't know if we know how to pay for that, but could be done. It also there's a missiologist named George Peters that wrote a book called The Theology of Church Growth. So now your hackles are up, so you stop listening. But here's what was insightful in that book. He said that the church always has this simultaneous dynamic of being stationary but also moving outward. And that when churches do well in a place, and this is a historical judgment in his case, so he's reading all this history of the mission of the church, and he says, when a church does well in a particular place and successfully, occupies a society, right? England goes from being a pagan society to a Christian society. The thing that it's going to do well is it's going to provide for outward movement simultaneous with stationary care of the already baptized. That makes sense to me. It also makes sense just observing seminarians as far as containing all the different personalities. That there are some guys who are kind of restless and dissatisfied, and we can use that too. We don't just need a guy that can stay in a place for a very, very long time or thinks he can or thinks he wants to. So, but we don't really have a funding model for the restless guys. I asked when I was a fourth year at the seminary to get an HVAC certification at the community college in Fort Wayne and then to get a call just to be a church planter within some geographic area. And, they told me, and Jeff Pulse still is the placement director. He was very honest. He's like, that's not a box we have, so that's going to be really hard to get rostered that way, and that's going to be hard for you and your family. So, and I'm thankful that he said that, but I wish there were a box for that. Go ahead, Bill.
Well, in a district that I may or may not be in, they use an interim pastor as a way to soften up the congregation to church growth methodology.
Yeah, right.
And is there maybe a different way to think about that, where you could use interim pastors that say the things that really need to be said, and then you get a guy that's going to take the call for a regular amount of time?
Yeah. I think interim pastors could be used in a helpful way. I think there's a presupposition about churches which is kind of overly psychological behind it, however, which is that you need some sort of transition period. It's like, and it's often mapped onto acceptance of grief almost. So it's a psychological map from an idea about how people handle death. I don't know. It's also the case that we actually already have people who are supposed to, who are actually charged with, so to speak, telling the congregation things that it needs to hear.
Absolutely.
Yeah. The itineracy thing, I think, should be used for the spread of the gospel, not for, I think for, this is a Paul word, governance, kubernetes, governance of churches. That is a stationary task. And so we should seek excellence in that within the structures that we have, which would be visitors, presidents, etc. Hopefully. Yeah.
So if you think there's a box that needs to be able to be checked and we don't even have the box, then what is the forum, or who would think, hey, perhaps we could create the box? Because it needs to be created not necessarily for church planting, but just for the feeding of the pastor's children. I have $150,000 worth of seminary debt, and the congregation with a parsonage is going to pay me $14,000 a year. So your HVAC certification is a whole lot more important than taking the the GRD? What's
GRE.
it? GRE, and having some accreditation from some certain model. I mean, it would seem to me we'd do better to take pipe fitters to the seminary these days than we would guys with whatever degree.
Yeah, so I expressed my nostalgia at lunch. Sorry if you weren't at my lunch table. I keep referring to it. I expressed my nostalgia for the Springfield Seminary prior to when they sought accreditation, because it really was an alternate route into the ministry. You didn't even need a high school degree. You showed up, they determined whether or not you could read or write well. They actually did teach that if you couldn't. After a while, after the Depression, they required a high school degree. And then you went into preaching, and one of the things that they taught every guy how to do was the basics of teaching school. Because you could teach outside your congregation, or more frequently you could teach inside your congregation, and that would help you. That would bring in some income. It was very it had the same sort of fraternal aspect that residential seminaries have. You had to go to Springfield, so you knew other guys, which was good. But it wasn't yoked to certain academic aspects of life that are going to hinder you from getting an HVAC certification. It would be great if we had a route by which it takes you 6 years to get through seminary, but you have a handicraft that allows you to move around and support yourself. That would be very realistic for both extant congregations and for church planting, and takes a lot of the burden off, say, going around having to raise your support model. I don't know of anyone who's doing that exactly. There are examples, the only examples I know of would be SMP guys, and the drawback there is a drawback that I see with guys also that colloquize in from a different church body, and they go directly into a Missouri Synod parish, which is one of the great benefits of the fact that we have seminaries is that we essentially all go to one of two fraternities. And that's good. and we know each other, and we know what each other's like, and that's good. And so it would be great to have something like Springfield used to be, where if you want full-on academics, you want to take Latin, go through the system. If you want something else, and you are a pipe fitter right now, or you want to learn how to do that in addition to your ministry, you go to Springfield. I think that was a good model. And they had high esprit de corps, which is essential. If the guys feel like they're not totally alone, even if in their parish they are, they're going to do a lot better than if they think that what they're facing is unique to them and their congregation is being rough on them and no one else knows. I mean, often right before guys leave the ministry and or leave for a different church, they isolate from other guys. And so I want to, diminish that as much as I possibly can. It's good for guys to feel like they're not the only person facing this problem. Yeah, Nathan, go ahead.
I have a Seminary 101 question.
Yes, sir.
So can you contrast 17 with the Great Commission? Why are these two statements different? Why is Paul saying, come to baptize, and yet Christ is saying, I send you out?
To baptize, yeah. To make disciples, baptizing and teaching. I think it is a division of labor, like Pastor Flamme is saying, and that has to do with, I don't think Paul's saying, I will never baptize anybody, but the main job I have is the proclamation of the gospel, let's say. Yeah. Because I think baptism, and even the process that Jesus outlines at the very end of Matthew's gospel, is a process that's going to entail, just because the apostles are moving around doesn't mean that local churches and local pastors at those churches are somehow just kind of a byproduct, because the process of making disciples is going to involve not only the extensive proclamation of repentance and faith, but the intensive teaching of whatsoever I have commanded you, in the words of the Great Commission.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's obvious that Paul is also baptizing there.
Right, he does. He does baptize. He just disavows that it's...
And it's also particular to Paul's calling that he has to go not just to one place, but to many places.
Right.
And not everybody has that specific calling.
Right, yeah.
Based on what he says a couple verses earlier, is it possible it's somewhat a bit of rhetoric too, because perhaps people are boasting they've been baptized by him. Lots of people have heard him preach, but not everyone's been baptized by him, right? So I was baptized by Paul. Who are you baptized by? Paul's saying, it doesn't matter. I'm here to preach the gospel to all of you.
Right. Yeah. I'm not really all that into baptism, so no. Yeah, no, it is because the specific connection to Paul is really important to people. And this I don't know. I don't know if you guys have found this in the wild. I have found this with not just people saying, well, my grandfather built this church. That's somewhat common. But I've even found it with sort of arcane Missouri Synod history. Like someone, will say, I was raised in Perry County, Missouri. Okay, right? But that's a big deal to them. That's a really big deal. We have a little less than a half hour. So I want to talk in chapter 4, 1 Corinthians 4, about the ministry as a stewardship, okay? So Paul sort of runs over the idea in 3 that the apostles are anything other than, as it were, a team. I planted, Apollos watered, God gave the growth. In 4, what he's anxious to state is that the nature of what he's doing is he is exercising a stewardship. And that's a word that in American English has come to mean, largely financial giving. Paul uses it as a description of the nature of the ministry. This is how one should regard us. This is how someone should think of us, right? So let's look at that in 1 Corinthians 4. Okay, if you don't want to think of us as especially important on our own, by ourselves, Apollos, Cephas, Paul, okay, then think of us this way. This is how one should regard us as servants of Christ, that is, very literally, slaves in Christ's household, slaves of Christ at the master's beckoning, okay, beck and call, and stewards of the mysteries of God. Mystery being a word that will come into Latin as sacrament, but is still at this time not merely, ritual acts instituted by Christ, but generally the revelations of God, the mysteries of God, things that God has revealed to man that only God could reveal. Stewards of the mysteries of God. And the image of a steward is of someone who is under orders. His orders, not, however, in this case, being from some sort of earthly employer, but being from Christ directly. Okay? Now, it is required of stewards that they be found faithful. So when he thinks about his ministry, he's thinking about when there is some sort of accounting or reckoning of that ministry. That accounting or reckoning, you'll notice, is not located within some kind of annual performance review. Okay? And this has to do with what we talked about with the lightness of human judgment. We'll see it in a second. This has to do with thinking about what you're doing on a daily basis under an eschatological lens. Because when I think about what I'm doing, obviously, within the ministry, it is of obvious significance. I don't have to wake up as a minister of Christ and think, what is my job for? It's of obvious eternal significance. Great. But I also want to think about people's judgments and my own judgments, and you'll see Paul express this, as relatively very light compared to the judgments and the accounting that will be rendered to Christ. So I think about each day in terms of the last day. How does he say this? But with me, it is a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by any human court. In fact, I do not even judge myself. Now, that cuts in both directions, right? You could say, I don't really care what you think of me. And usually when people are saying that today, or they say, don't judge, they have in fact judged themselves and accounted themselves as good, right? So if someone says, don't judge me, what he's actually saying is, my judgment is the only one that's important, and I think what I'm doing or saying is good, so don't you say anything about it. That's what they really mean. Paul actually says, I don't even judge myself. So how does that play out? For I am not aware of anything against myself, but I am not thereby acquitted. This has to do with Paul's discussion of his own conscience. This comes up also in his speeches in Acts. That is that Paul strives, he says, as my forefathers did, to serve God with a clear conscience. Now, this is very difficult in relationship to the pastoral ministry because a lot of the things that even just the vocabulary that we use in terms of the pastoral ministry does not have to do with conscience. It has more to do with emotional or relational dynamics. Think about on your part of your personal information form, if a congregation gets information about you, they get the personal information form and the self-evaluation tool. That's what SET stands for, that's right. And there's a part of the personal information form filled out by your district president, and it says, there's a scale. Are you guys familiar with this? Yeah. There's a scale, and at one end of the scale, what's at the right end of the scale? Strict. Rigid, that's it. What's the other end of the scale? What's the adjective? Pastoral. Okay? So think about that. That doesn't really have to do with your conscience. It doesn't say this guy has a clear conscience or a bad conscience or a weak conscience or a strong conscience. What that really is he's nice or he's difficult, or whatever, right, exactly, And so what that means is even the adjective pastoral is associated with sort of a certain way of relating to people, not specific decisions you've made or specific things you've preached, right? So even a lot of the way that we think about the pastoral ministry has really been so heavily psychologized that the concept of talking about your conscience in relation to the ministry is hard for some people to understand. That what I'm saying and what I'm doing and the way that I'm behaving is governed by the fact that I want a clear conscience. Okay? Let me give you a personal story time, not a long story, but I had this guy, very, very difficult man. He was very wealthy, and I wasn't respecting his opinion about open communion. Okay, and he was from New York. He had lived most of his life in New Jersey. He had retired to where I was in Pennsylvania, and I instituted closed communion. We had been practicing open communion probably, as far as I could determine, for 40 years. Old English district congregation, English district, you may know, led Seminex. So this is an old English district. We are original English Synod, East Coast, open communion a long time. So I instituted closed communion, and he said it, and I do believe him when he said this. He said, I never heard of this in my life. I do believe that he had never heard of it, based on kind of his experience of the Missouri Synod. And he went down to Florida on vacation, and he asked the pastor, why at that church in Florida, it was a Missouri Synod, what's wrong with this guy? Young, stupid guy, that's his problem, right? And he was like, well, the pastor said, which seminary did he go to? And this older gentleman says, Fort Wayne, and the guy goes, well, there you go. Yep. So anyway, so he's extremely antagonistic to me. After a while, isn't really showing up. So I go over to his house, and he had been an insurance executive. So a lot of money, real nice house, very awkward 1.5 hour conversation. And he said to me, don't you know that this upsets people? And I said, of course I know that. And he didn't have anything to say after that. And the reason that he didn't was not because I just shut him down amazingly or something. It's because his presumption was that the main thing that I should do is make people feel a certain way. And he was flabbergasted that I would do something that I knew consciously made people angry at me, at least some people. Not in the way that I was implementing it, but just the fact that I would. Okay? And the reason he was flabbergasted is because he thought that my main job was to essentially, and I don't think I'm being trite, keep them happy. I think he sincerely believed that, right? And so the idea that you would do something that you knew was upsetting somebody because it was on your conscience to do it, even though there would be whatever blowback, right? That was kind of foreign to him. And I think it is foreign to how not just some of our folks, but also some of our pastors think about what they do. That it is mainly a job concerning emotional and relational dynamics. And of course it is that too, right? I'm not going to go about it like a total jerk for no reason, but that's not the whole job. And you can see that, right? So he says in Acts, I serve my God with a clear conscience. Here he says, I am not acquitted, but I'm not aware of anything against myself. I don't do something and then say, well, God will understand, or whatever. Things that if someone wanted to get a divorce and said, Pastor, I know God understands, we would say out of hand, nope, right? So he's not consciously doing anything that he believes God will look upon with disapproval. He's not thereby acquitted, but he's not trying to contravene what he knows is right. Okay. If that's too obvious, we can move on. But if it's not, or if you want to talk about how that's applied, go ahead. What happened? They were on their way out anyway. And part of it, closed communion was a good doctrinal occasion for him to also explore the fact that he had been in control of the previous pastor and was not in control of me.
What do we learn about insurance executives through this? They don't please me.
That when when you are accustomed in every other realm of life to being in charge, and suddenly you're not in charge, it's shocking to people. Especially when you have money, because that gets you so much in America. And then it's like, yeah.
So then the conscience is not in any way a determinative force in his vocation, but instead his main motivation is just money, would you say?
I think power dynamics were the issue there. And that with the previous pastor, he had been able to take him out to lunch every week. He always paid. And the pastor would kind of tell him everything that had gone wrong in the parish that week, if you can believe it. And then he would give him advice. And I wasn't doing that.
That's not uncommon.
Yeah.
I have the same thing.
Yeah. And so those power dynamics are really important. And it's never on the call paperwork. What those might be. Yeah. Okay. All right. We'll do a little bit more here. We have about 10 minutes left in today. I am not aware of anything against myself, but I am not thereby acquitted. It is the Lord who judges me. Therefore, do not pronounce judgment before the time, before the Lord comes, who will bring to light the things now hidden in darkness. So that could be a reference to evils, but there are also things that could be, obviously unknown to men that are wonderful things now hidden in darkness. And will disclose the purposes of the heart. Then each one will receive his commendation from God. Okay. So when he's thinking about the nature of his ministry, he's always thinking about the last day. And that just simply puts a lot of things into much different light than the currently ongoing emotional or relational dynamics, the currently ongoing approval or disapproval, praise or blame. It also, I think, changes your time horizon for what you're trying to achieve. That perhaps certain goals, and this is not maybe as common among ministers as it is among guys that have to run publicly traded companies, but having a short time horizon is generally very bad for the long-term health of whatever it is that you're trying to do well, because it turns you into a crisis manager instead of a planner. And if I have a longer time horizon, then I'm probably going to make better decisions because I have a better understanding of how these three decisions fit together in 5 years, or could, than if it's like, how do I react to this? Now how do I react to this? Now how do I react to this? As if I am sort of just doing PR. I think it also explains specifically to Paul why Paul is able to ask things that seem counterintuitive to begin with. Example being something he'll ask the Corinthians in the next letter. I want you to give money to people who have caused you only trouble. That is, the churches in Judea. I want you to relieve them, relieve their suffering. Over the long term, if what you sow is what you reap, this will be gain for you. He can say that honestly. In the short term, it doesn't make sense because in the short term, they have generally just caused problems for Gentile churches. But you should do this because they are suffering, and you should do this because it will be good for you to give sincerely, right? I think the reason that he can say that is because he can look, or at least imagine, even if he's not there, that this will be beneficial to them. And he's not so much worried about the awkwardness in the present of, I'm asking you to do something for people that have, in living memory, caused you quite a bit of trouble. Anything else on stewardship? I have a cross-reference I want to look at, but anything else on stewardship in 1 Corinthians 4 before we go forward?
Mysterion, Latin, sacrament.
Yeah.
you had a wide definition of mystery.
Right.
Lutheran view on the sacraments. I mean, how did this passage?
Yeah, I think that this is very easily applied to what you're doing, especially with whom will I baptize and whom will I commune. Very easily, that's an application of this text, but I think the text is broadly about the fact that, like the scribe that's pictured in Matthew, I am bringing out in my proclamation of the gospel what is old and what is new. You know, as a steward is going to bring out this thing, this dish, that dish, this wine, right? That the art here is all about an art, I think, of application. So if I think about the pastoral ministry, what I'm largely thinking about is the nature of necessary application. Abstractly, anybody, you could say, couples coming in for premarital counseling. So you call in somebody that knows a lot about the history of marriage in the Lutheran Church. You fly him in for 2 hours to sit down and talk to this couple. That's not really pastoral ministry. They need to talk about what it's like between them and what they're planning to do with their life, and what having children would be like. And the art there is always the art of application. So when you think about steward of the mysteries, yeah, that's applied to the sacrament specifically, but I think one reason it's such an apt description for the pastoral ministry is that I think the whole art of the thing is the art of application. That's exactly what a steward does, right? If a steward brings out too much wine, everybody gets drunk before the food's even brought out. I mean, there is an art to it, to stewardship. Let's just do a cross-reference real quick. I want to go to Titus 1, 7 through 9. Titus 1. So notice some of the vocabulary Paul picks up. Some of it we've seen already in Acts 20, that it is necessary for an overseer, a bishop, a minister of God, as what? As God's steward. What do you have in your English Bible? It's the same word as 1 Corinthians 4, oikonomos.
ESV has me not. New King James has steward.
Well, yeah. Anybody have something different? Titus 1:7. Hosteu oikonomon, as God's economist. If we're going to be desperately literalistic. Yes, it's steward. It's the same word as 1 Corinthians 4. As God's steward, okay? So if I'm going to be skilled in the art of bringing out what needs to be eaten and drunk, then what will I be like? I will be above reproach, not arrogant or quick-tempered or a drunkard or violent or greedy for gain, but hospitable, a lover of good, self-controlled, upright, holy, and disciplined. I don't think Paul's saying this as a joke. So why is he saying this? He's saying this because there is a certain kind of man that will be apt. We say apt to teach, and I think we talk about that like it's an academic qualification. It certainly has to do with skills that we teach in academic institutions. But like I said, I think it has to do with someone who will be apt in application. That because of the nature of his own life, he will understand the nature of, for instance, discipline or graciousness or the management of his family in 1 Timothy 3. That the qualifications are there not merely as a sort of, nobody measures up to this, but that part of the proclamation of the message is that the proclaimer is a certain kind of a man who is therefore able to understand not just in a merely academic fashion what is the right thing, but what is the right thing to say to this person in this case right now, right? That's why I find preaching endlessly fascinating, because it's something at which you can always get better, right? Not just in public speaking or something, but in the art of application, right? Which is what Paul says in 1 Timothy 3:16 is what you're doing when you're preaching. The word of God is useful and profitable for, right? That's all the art of application. So even when you see the same word here, one of the profitable things about using either a Pauline synopsis or a concordance or something is that you're able to jump to somewhere else where he's actually going to say more about stewardship. And it's particularly helpful with Paul because Paul so rarely says explicitly, clearly, and all at once what he means. Okay? He'll say in a fragment, this thing, very enlightening, and then in another flash elsewhere, like here, with a closer definition of steward, here's what a steward is. This is what a steward is like. Okay? I don't want a guy who's going to just bring out all the wine at the beginning of the evening, for instance. Well, so what kind of guy do I need? Well, I need a guy who's disciplined, right? So, especially when you're working with Paul, jumping around is really helpful because there's not a storyline that you need to keep straight the way you do with the Gospels. I actually like a synopsis better for Paul than for the Gospels because I want each of the Gospels to kind of do what it's doing in the way that it does it, right? Mark likes to hide things. Matthew likes to go explicitly on at length. Luke likes to tell a story in a really moving way. I actually like the synopsis less well for the Gospels than I do for Paul, because Paul just likes to throw a word out and expect you to pick it up again when he brings it back in Titus, right? So I find the synopsis really helpful for that. Anything else for today? We have a couple minutes. Questions, comments? Thought? Yes, sir.
In Titus 1, in that list, what does Paul mean when he says holy?
Yeah. So in Titus 1:8, you get a word which is not quite, he doesn't say hagios in the sense that all the saints are holy, they are the hagioi. He says hosion, for which we don't have a great English equivalent. And I wouldn't translate it as holy exactly because it sounds like it sounds too much like hagios. I would say that it's something more like, the reason it's hard is because in Greek it's sort of a container word. So when something is sound, it could be described as hosion. That is, if I put something in it, stuff isn't going to spill out. And I think I know what I mean by that when I would almost say like trustworthy or sound or something. But something to express that if I tell you something, not just that you can keep a secret that needs to be kept, but that you're not sort of like spilling. Not even. If I put it there, it'll stay there. Okay? Reliable, sound. Yeah. If I close the doors on the vehicle, they're not just going to like pop open when I'm driving. I don't know how else to say it except in a picture. Because we don't quite have a word for this. Not one that I can think of anyway. Yep. What's that? Integrity. Yeah, possessing integrity. Okay. All right. So we'll stop there for the day. We'll pick up at